The Invincible comic series by Robert Kirkman is an incredibly compelling superhero story that often boldly flips the traditional staples of the genre on its head, and in its massive world, among the cast of characters, Dinosaurus stands out as one of the most morally complex. He's not motivated by destruction or personal gain or revenge, but instead, he embodies a radical utilitarian philosophy, believing that the ends justify the means when it comes to saving this planet, no matter how extreme these solutions need to be. Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and welcome back to the comic book analysis and examination series we do here. As you can tell, today we are departing from our usual X-Men focused comic analysis, and we're taking a look at Invincible, specifically the character of Dinosaurus, his tragic narrative arc, and how this critiques the ethical dilemmas of superhero fiction. First, let's give some context for who Dinosaurus is and how he plays a role in the Invincible series. This character is similar to the Hulk in a sense because Dinosaurus is actually the dissociative personality of David Anders, sort of just your regular chill, laid-back guy. In fact, we first learn about this when Dinosaurus attacks Invincible as he's fixing some of the destruction that was caused during the Invincible War, which, if you're unfamiliar with what that is, basically a bunch of evil Invincible variants from the multiverse came to our Invincible universe thanks to Angstrom Levy and destroyed many cities. And during this initial fight with Invincible, Dinosaurus' main grief is that Invincible should not be trying to repair the infrastructure of these damaged cities, arguing that, for example, all of this destruction leads to less carbon emissions, thus staving off climate change. Regular people rebuilding the cities would have employed millions and led to the strongest global economy, and that in trying to help in the immediate, Invincible is actually condemning future millions to their death. And this is where that Hulk trope sort of gets flipped on its head for Dinosaurus. He's not really just some raging beast. He is extremely intelligent, and a lot of thought goes into his plans and his philosophy. And while Bruce Banner's transformation into the Hulk is defined by an uncontrollable rage, for Dinosaurus' counterpart David Anders, it's actually apathy or boredom or this sense of disconnection from the world around him that triggers this transformation into Dinosaurus. Now, the loss of bodily autonomy here when the transformation occurs is important to note because, as we see in this first interaction with Invincible here, when Dinosaurus reverts back to David Anders, David is aware of Dinosaurus and his plans, but there's ultimately nothing he can do to stop it. And registering what a massive threat Dinosaurus could potentially be already, Mark grabs David by the neck, and it seems like he was considering here just taking out that threat right then and there, but the Guardians of the Globe show up, which takes away that option from Mark. But when he discusses this with Adam Eve later, we learn that he did intend to kill David right there. And after all Mark's been through at this point in the comic, all the tragedy and trauma, we can see that even he is sort of disillusioned with traditional superhero ethics, positioning it as sort of this Sisyphean task where it will just lead to more and more death and destruction unless something changes. And I think it's really important to bring up here because it's going to be super important later, and it does mark a change for Mark, is that during an invasion from the alien Sequids, Mark actually chooses to kill the innocent host, Russ Livingston, in order to stop this invasion, which does have a subtle ripple effect in this entire series because 1, this is the first person Mark kills, and 2, Mark kills this innocent person to save the entire planet, a utilitarianism approach. And we later on even get Mark really justifying this to himself, saying that there was no other way, he had to do this, which may not be entirely true, as we do know Robot was working on other methods, but arguably this was the safest and quickest way to stop the invasion. Now, the next time we see Dinosaurus isn't for many issues. In fact, it happens after the Viltrumite War, so Mark had been gone in space for a long time and is now just getting back to Earth. But when we we do see him again. He's being imprisoned pretty harshly, and he's complaining about how he didn't really commit these crimes, he wasn't in charge of Dinosaurus, and he's essentially being tortured because this is so incredibly boring. And that is where the real revelation comes, that boredom is what sparks the transformation into Dinosaurus. And with this transformation from boredom, Dinosaurus escapes. What's so interesting though is that when we first saw this character so many issues ago, it didn't seem like there'd be a real impact. This was sort of just another character for Mark to punch and move on with his life. But when Dinosaurus and Invincible do meet again, it's because Dinosaurus is attacking Las Vegas. And this time, Dinosaurus immediately questions Mark's validity as a hero, saying if he was a real hero, they'd be on the same side and Mark would be helping Dinosaurus evacuate Las Vegas. So what's going on here, and why is Dinosaurus trying to evacuate the city and trying to get Mark to help him with that? Well, that's because he planted many bombs that he created himself around Las Vegas in order to destroy the entire city. And again, he has a little monologue here about why he wants to do that, citing that this city drains natural resources, the Colorado River is going to dry up, the region will not be able to sustain itself, and the area itself, being that desert, is a perfect spot for a large solar station that would be big enough to power the entire country with clean energy. That way, we wouldn't have to be as reliant on fossil fuels anymore. And because of the time that he wastes talking to Invincible, Dinosaurus realizes that he's gonna be hit in this Las Vegas blast too, and he was planning on also evacuating himself, but that doesn't seem like it's going to be possible anymore, and he's not sure he will survive this blast. And he says that's a pity because there's so much more good he could have done. And it's some fascinating insight into his psyche because he clearly believes that he's really a force of good, and he even paints himself sort of as this self-sacrificing visionary, willing to put his life on the line for that greater good. And before anyone starts thinking like, hey, this Dinosaurus guy's got some good ideas, the greater good is more important here, this comic is absolutely not trying to say that. It's a majorly flawed philosophy here because it's rooted in arrogance, it dehumanizes the people that it wants to protect, and it prioritizes abstract, long-term outcomes that couldn't possibly be predictable, and posits that the immediate, tangible human suffering is worth it. But the reason that this plot point exists and is important in the comics is because this is really the first time that Mark is forced to confront his own ideals and limitations as a superhero. It's part of the domino effect of him grappling with not just saving lives in the moment, but how to create real, lasting, meaningful change. And of course, Mark feels really awful about what happened with Vegas in the immediate aftermath. And he goes from trending disillusion to full-blown disillusioned with superheroing, telling Adam Eve that he got into all this not because his dad, not because his powers, but because he wanted to make the world a better place. But despite that foundation of idealism, he feels utterly powerless against the enormity of just sort of systemic problems. He doesn't want to any longer participate in the traditional superhero paradigm, as he sort of calls it, just beating the snot out of crazy or disturbed people. And he ends this moment of reflection by saying, "We have the power to change the world, Eve, but instead it keeps getting worse." And this really cements his true frustration with this inability to enact any meaningful change. With all the power they have, theoretically they should be able to make a substantial difference in the world. It's sort of a superhero existential crisis, but it also is a spark for Mark's growth. It pushes him to redefine what it means to be a hero and think about it in another way. And we see these ideas starting to evolve in Mark's head as he has this conversation later when he's talking with Cecil about how his entire perspective is going to be different moving forward, because recently he's actually just talked to a few villains and was able to really work things out without violence. And Dinosaurus comes up in this conversation by Mark as one of those villains who was actually trying to help humanity in their own messed up way, and Mark thinks that there's something to that, something he can work with there. Now the next time Dinosaurus pops up, it's actually in his David Anders form, and he feels obviously really terrible about the atrocity that happened with Vegas blowing up. It was not in his control and it was not his desire. So he's turning himself in because of this, with the caveat this time that though he knows he will be imprisoned, he's going to need to be entertained to some degree in there so he doesn't experience that indifference that turns him into Dinosaurus again. And so they set him up there with some TV and good food. But things end up developing quite rapidly as Mark goes and he sees what happened in Vegas and what's currently happening, and it looks like they started moving forward with Dinosaurus' plans to put solar panels in that space instead. And another aspect of this that is super notable is that the two scientists who really integrated these solar panels created a new version of solar panels and got all of this clean energy working efficiently are two rehabilitated villains that Invincible has faced before. And while Cecil was trying to show this to Mark so that he could show him some good came out of something terrible, this does click a bit incorrectly for Mark, because what he gleams from this is that Dinosaurus was right. And Mark pulls a drastic action following up this thought because he goes to break David out of his confinement, and even further than that, to bring out Dinosaurus. And it's a kind of a comedic moment here, the way that he does that with Dinosaurus, because in order to activate David's indifference, Mark basically just tells him the entire story of his life so far. And as the Dinosaurus form comes out, they do not immediately start fighting, because Dinosaurus has come to the conclusion that if Mark is doing this, he must have finally seen the light, seen the way that Dinosaurus thinks, and deemed it correct. And they sort of have this back and forth where Dinosaurus is still sort of talking about how the ends justify the means, but Mark is confronting him and drawing a moral line in the sand here, reaffirming that the loss of innocent lives, no matter what, is completely unacceptable to him. We also get a brief glimmer of how things aren't exactly aligned in a realistic way in Dinosaurus' mind, as he tries to make a comparison between Invincible fighting Omni-Man and all the lives that were lost in that fight, and what he did with Vegas. Now, Invincible doesn't really get into the weeds of arguing that, because he instead begins to talk about how he's trapped in this cycle of reactive heroism, and he says, after seeing the solar panel array being built, Mark thinks that perhaps if they work together, they can avoid Dinosaurus' terrible methods and save the world without those deaths. So Mark is trying to remedy basically these two worldviews and strike a balance between impact and ethical integrity. And with that, Mark makes a pivotal move to help Dinosaurus escape. A decision which will have far-reaching implications for Mark's relationships and the world at large. And on one hand, this move does reflect Mark's idealism and his courage, and there is something kind of noble about that growing frustration with traditional superheroism and his strong desire to actually change stuff. But this also does highlight how to some degree he's pretty naive and overconfident. And immediately we start to get cracks of how these two diverging worldviews are irreconcilable. The first time we see Dinosaurus and Invincible really working together is when they show up to this fight with this big bad basically, who's taken out a bunch of Mark's friends, and Mark is like, why didn't you tell me about this earlier? And basically Dinosaurus is like, well, I wanted to prioritize the irrigation project we were working on. That was much more important in the grand scheme of things. Again, viewing individual lives as secondary to larger goals of systemic change. Now, Mark continues to try and justify this alliance, saying he knows what he's doing to Robot, to Eve, and to Cecil, but all of this gets momentarily stopped in its tracks when Mark gets infected with the Scourge virus during a confrontation with Oliver and Alan the Alien, who want to use this new strain of it to eliminate the Viltrumite threat by releasing it into Earth's atmosphere so it will affect the Viltrumites who are currently living there. And during a struggle to prevent its deployment, Oliver accidentally discharges it right into Mark's face and he gets infected. Now, Dinosaurus becomes a key player with this whole plotline because he actually gets recruited to help figure out a cure for this virus. But even before Mark makes any type of recovery, Dinosaurus saves his life because Thragg, the leader of the Viltrumite Empire, while examining his DNA to also try and find a cure, realizes that Mark is the heir to the Viltrumite Empire. He's got the royal blood in him. And because Thragg doesn't want to cede his position to who he perceives to be a traitor, he decides to kill Mark. But thankfully, Dinosaurus spots this and tries to attack him, but he is much too strong for him. But being the incredibly intelligent character that Dinosaurus is, he also has a backup plan where if his heart rate goes up, he's got a system monitoring it that will set off bombs on the ship that they're currently working on. Now, Thragg has this pretty cool moment where he tries to just stop Dinosaurus's heart, but the heart rate obviously increases because of the damage that's being dealt to his chest. So Dinosaurus gets tossed aside and he just sort of starts walking back to go kill Mark, and Dinosaurus goes in for a huge head chomp right there. We see the teeth going flying as it does really no damage to Thragg at all. And so what Thragg does is basically take Dinosaurus by the jaw and snout and just rip his head open, essentially, not killing him though, just really breaking his jaw and mouth, I guess. Now Thragg realizes that if he continues to just pulverize Dinosaurus like this, bombs will keep going off on the ship, so he heads off to take care of those explosions because basically the ship has a lot of important artifacts of Viltrumite history on it, but he does promise that when he gets back, Dinosaurus will not be killed, but will wish he was dead. Now in this intermediate period though, Dinosaurus is able to grab Mark and escape. And when Adam Eve goes to investigate what happened, Thragg lies to her and blames Dinosaurus, saying that Dinosaurus kidnapped him and just ran off basically. And in making his way back to their secret hideout, Dinosaurus actually sustained such major injuries that he ended up reverting back into human form, David. And this is an interesting moment because David talks to Invincible and he's like, look man, am I still doing evil? This thing is pure evil. And Mark's like, no, it's fine. And he's like, are you sure? Are you sure I didn't trick you into getting this virus? And Mark even explains how he views Dinosaurus sort of like his brother Oliver, saying that they both sort of lack this concern, this empathy for humans. But with Dinosaurus, he is a being of pure intelligence, not evil. But when Mark is able to eventually instill some indifference in David again, we do get the return of Dinosaurus, who explains to Mark that the Viltrumites tried to kill him. And unfortunately for Dinosaurus, basically everyone comes crashing down on him in his secret base here, thinking that he did kidnap Mark, since that is what Adam Eve thought. And when basically no one is listening to Mark, when he's like, please stop fighting, Mark tries to defend Dinosaurus by punching Alan the alien, but due to the Scourge virus, as you can see here, he's left in a pretty weakened state, and the punch actually causes his entire arm to basically shatter and be annihilated. Now Mark does eventually start to recover from this, but he does lose the connection with Dinosaurus here a bit, so Dinosaurus is basically just, again, this radical utilitarian being that is out on its own now, operating on its own autonomy. And as Mark tells Adam Eve, he's got no idea what he could be working on. And so once Mark's powers have fully recovered, he goes to the secret base and he checks in on Dinosaurus, but instead of Dinosaurus having upheld their shared vision for making meaningful changes to the world without violence or mass destruction, Dinosaurus starts monologuing about, he did what he had to do, Mark, you were powerless, you have to believe me, I've analyzed all the data for countless hours and days, and again, this was the only way. So what extreme action has Dinosaurus taken for the greater good now? Well, he basically tells Mark that without immediate drastic action, 80% of the population on Earth could die within a century, leading to humanity's potential extinction because of catastrophic climate change. And so his solution is to destroy Los Angeles to reduce those emissions and spark a global response. And again, a tragic flaw of this extremist utilitarian method is that human lives are again reduced to just numbers and a calculation, and in disregarding all of this, he isolates those like Mark who do share his broader goals. But as he puts it to Mark, millions must die in order for billions to survive. Now, Mark gets the Guardians of the Globe involved and makes a frantic effort to try and save Los Angeles. They do find these bombs, but they're actually not bombs, they're devices that are going to set off a chain chain reaction that would cause a massive earthquake. And they're able to destroy a fair amount of these, thus seemingly saving the city from its ultimate destruction, but still thousands have already died due to these earthquake devices. And Dinosaurus shortly after shows up on the scene, and the stage is set for the final ideological confrontation between Mark and Dinosaurus. The poorly stringed together alliance that they've had has been truly broken now. Mark lets Dinosaurus know that they will never again work together to save the world, it's done. And Dinosaurus has a strange cryptic response here saying, well, we'll just have to wait and see about that. You're smart, Mark, but apparently not smart enough to see that this was all a distraction. And as if Mark hasn't already reached a breaking point now, fully understanding that Dinosaurus isn't just misguided, but he's dangerous and completely untrustworthy, Dinosaurus reveals that he has orchestrated a global catastrophe flooding major multiple locations around the world, and this was his true plan all along, and Mark is too late to stop it. And this is terrible for Mark. He's horrified by the scope of the destruction and the loss of life that he's responsible for, really, for setting Dinosaurus free. And Mark, consumed by guilt and anger, starts lashing out at Dinosaurus, while Dinosaurus still tries to calmly dismiss Mark's anger as a failure to understand the bigger picture. But Mark is now done debating, and he declares that for the sake of humanity, Dinosaurus must die, because while he's got good ideas and he can recognize problems others aren't even thinking about yet, he's clearly insane. And Dinosaurus himself counters with one last attempt to justify himself, saying he's got the data, he knows what lies ahead, he knows what he's doing is right, and if Mark refuses to help, or if Mark stands in his way, it's him who has to die. And as this fight continues and it's being broadcasted across the world, Dinosaurus takes Mark's head in his hands and crushes his head, killing Invincible in front of everyone. Well, seemingly so, because we soon learn that this was another elaborate ruse by Dinosaurus, and that while working on a cure for the Scourge virus, Dinosaurus had learned so much about Viltrumites and their physiology, and he also collected a lot of DNA, and he used this DNA and that knowledge to create a clone of Mark, and so he exploited a Viltrumite weakness, which is their ears, and he set this specific frequency which put Mark in this comatose state, and then Dinosaurus killed the clone in front of the world, and he justifies doing this because he says that he's freed Mark from all of his worldly obligations now. He's no longer a villain, he didn't cause this, he died trying to defeat the one who did, he's a martyr. So he's free to continue trying to save the world with Dinosaurus, but obviously Mark is completely appalled by this and confronts Dinosaurus about this destruction, the betrayal, and the moral hypocrisy and arrogance of his actions. And while Mark and Dinosaurus are communicating while Mark is in this comatose state, we then get this long speech from Mark that is a masterclass rebuttal and deconstruction of Dinosaurus' utilitarian worldview, and he argues that by removing this immediate threat of ecological collapse, Dinosaurus has actually stolen humanity's opportunity to adapt and grow and create sustainable solutions on their own. He didn't really fix anything, he just pushed it down the line. The coming crisis will still be coming, it's just a little further away now. But what Dinosaurus did is enable humanity to continue their destructive behaviors by alleviating the symptoms without addressing the systemic root cause, what Mark really wanted to do all along. And this is the short-sightedness of Dinosaur's actions, even though he thinks he's thinking in long term. And we also get this moment of moral awakening from Mark when he is saying that the villain always thinks he's the hero in his story, and he's been trying to justify why these two have been working together, saying that their plans were good, the goals were just, but was Mark really just trying to convince himself all along that he hadn't turned and lost sight of himself becoming the bad guy? And it seems like that's the case. And this impassioned and logical speech about accountability actually sparks something in Dinosaurus that was unexpected. He admits Mark is right, he releases Mark from his comatose state, and it seems like there's a profound shift in his perspective. Dinosaurus acknowledges his moral failure, revealing that he seems to have been ego-driven in his nature himself. He admits that he kind of saw himself as a god, bestowing wisdom on his flock, and he confronts the ultimate truth that his actions were not motivated by altruism, but instead by his own sense sense of superiority and self-importance. And even this stands as another point for why Dinosaurus is such an interesting character. He is a villain, but even this most radical figure is capable of self-reflection when he's faced with the consequences of his actions. And Mark says, okay then, so help me fix this. There's gotta be some way we can get the ocean water out of the cities, but Dinosaurus rejects this idea of redemption, citing that this is his end point, and he knows that if he ended up trying to help again, it would probably eventually revert back to him doing something monstrous that he thinks is right and just. He understands the cycle now, and he wants to stop it. His ideological rigidity is the death of him, and with that, he asks Mark to end his life. He resigns himself to his own destructiveness. He sees that he himself was the ultimate threat to humanity, and Mark obliges and takes the life of Dinosaurus. And so, as we come to an end here, what was the Dinosaurus arc fundamentally about? Well, it was about challenging Mark's worldview and forcing him to grow. As he's been a superhero for so long now, he has often approached his problems with a very straightforward mindset. Identify a villain, stop them, save the day. But meeting Dinosaurus and seeing how his actions were rooted in an ideology with the veneer of helpfulness instead of malice introduced a complexity that Mark wasn't quite equipped to handle. But this was a catalyst for Mark's evolution as a hero into one that is more mature and reflective. It takes away his reliance on brute force and luck and forces him to grapple with the complex nature of morality, leadership, and long-term consequences, even going so far as to reframe heroism. Mark still wants to address systemic problems, and now he's going to move forward from this failure and work with Cecil in the way that he tried to work with Dinosaurus, carrying the burden of his past mistakes and now realizing that he needs to approach things with more than just strength and determination. He needs to be thoughtful, deliberate, and ultimately a more effective version of Invincible. Alright, thank you guys so much for checking out this video, especially if you made it to the end. I know this was a long one, but this is fascinating stuff. And if you did enjoy this, please consider leaving a comment so I know that people enjoy this type of content. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time, so I would greatly appreciate that. Okay guys, with that, you all have a great rest of your day. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.